Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second series of the Chicago Dialogues. And this is the inaugural episode of the second series. I am Dipesh Chakraborty. I am currently the faculty director of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. And this series, as was last year, is being run in collaboration with Prohor.in. It is my extreme honor and privilege to introduce to you very briefly my esteemed colleague Muzaffar Alam, whom we are featuring in this episode, and who will be in conversation with none other than Avik Chanda, the writer of a best-selling book on Darashuko, a multi-talented person who was the anchor for this series last year and will be anchoring the series this year again. We are wonderfully happy to have Avik with us back conducting the series. Avik will actually introduce Muzaffar Alam in more detail than I will, but let me simply share with you some impressions that I've had with Professor Alam's work and life, and my impressions of him as a as a partner in thinking about both modern and pre-modern South Asia. Muzaffar Alam is today, I think, the doyen of Mughal history among, I would say, among non-retired historians. There's still Irfan Habib, but Muzaffar's teachers are either sadly gone or retired. And I think Muzaffar is easily the most important, or at least one of the most important historians of Mughal India, historians of Muslim India, and actually historians of Islam in India. And when I think of Muzaffar's life and work, it seems to me, as his colleague, his friend, somebody who is engaged in conversations with him, that his lifelong quest has been to understand, or one of his lifelong quests has been to understand what happened to Islam after it came to South Asia. Did Islam remain the universalist, Sharia oriented creed that it always was, has been? Or did the land and its culture and its traditions have a profound influence on Islam as it developed and found itself in the subcontinent? Did Islam engage in a conversation, in a civilizational conversation with what existed in South Asia, with South Asia's civilizational, even the pre-Islamic civilizational heritage? And that profound question has led Professor Alam, or my friend Muzaffar, to particularly to examine Sufi text. And one big transition, I think, in Professor Alam's career or training or in the arc of his work, that I find it, is actually the transition from having been trained in the old Aligarh school of political and economic history, and having been trained that way, but then refashioning himself into a historian of culture, of political ideas, and profoundly interested in what an Indic version of Islam or an Indian Islam contributed to not only politics but even to the development of political thought in pre-British India. And he's very careful in his book, this book, and also the book on political Islam, to actually look at Sufism not simply kind of as a fixed set of doctrine, but rather as evolving set of thoughts, and to distinguish 19th century Sufi thinking, for instance, from what preceded Sufi thought. And the new book is very much engaged in that historian's enterprise of actually showing us what would Sufism look like if we were not too influenced by 19th century perceptions of Sufism. But this profound lifelong quest of Muzaffar Alam's about understanding Islam in the South Asian context. And he joins some very respectable line of intellectuals in asking that question. This profound lifelong interest has now culminated in the book we're discussing today, The Mughals and the Sufis, Islam and Political uh, Imagination in India, 1500 to 1750. And I'm delighted that Abhik, with a tremendous interest in Muslim India, in Mughal India, is here to engage in this conversation with Professor Alam. I have absolutely no doubt that this will be a feast of ideas that we will all enjoy. Welcome to you again to the first inaugural episode, and over to you, Avik. Thank you.
Dipita, I think maybe there's some. Thank you so much, Dipita. I think there might be a little bit of a technical glitch. I don't see Professor Alam, so perhaps if you would give me
Oh,
another minute while you continue your
sure,
observation or your thoughts around Professor, I'll just call him up and see where it's going. Right? Thank you.
sure. Oh, okay. So we have this, yeah, technical problem. But well, I was just going to say that that in this series, actually going forward, we have so we've changed it somewhat from last year's. We will have, of course, we will be showcasing work that is done by Chicago faculty, but we've also decided to present conversations between Chicago faculty and scholars, intellectuals, eminent personalities we consider friends of the University of Chicago. So we will have soon an episode featuring David Schulman, the great Indologist, who is based in Israel, but who has long-term connections with Chicago. The other person who will be featuring is also Jerry Rao. Jerry is an entrepreneur who's based, works out of Bombay and Bengaluru, but who is also an intellectual and has produced two books, two interesting books. One that he calls The Indian Conservative. It's a kind of manifesto of philosophical political conservatism. Very interesting, provoking, and even a provocative book. And we will be engaging Jerry in a conversation about that book, as well as another book he's written on more recently on Gandhian economics. Both very interesting books. And Jerry's, of course, had long connections with Chicago. He was a student in our business school. He has served on the board of trustees for the center in Delhi, and has generally been a friend and a well-wisher of the university. And the other person we would also feature is actually the very well-known famous anthropologist and social theorist, Arjun Appadurai. Arjun did his PhD from Chicago, taught in Chicago before he left Chicago for Yale and then the New School, and then NYU, the New York University. But we will be talking about Arjun's life and work later on in this series. Again, a conversation about his work. But we'll also, alongside these people whom I've categorized as friends of Chicago, we'll also be featuring people who are on our faculty and who has done very interesting work. There is a fascinating and very well-known pediatrician we have on our faculty who does surgery on little babies on urological problems, and who is a pioneer of robotic surgery, and who is also somebody who is engaged in taking this technology to South Asia. He's from South Asia, Professor Mohan Gundeti. We will be talking about his work. So there are a lot of interesting programs coming ahead. I'm sorry about the technical glitch we seem to be having. So I will take myself off the screen at this point and ask for your patience and I'm sure Avik will advise us soon as to what's happening and if we'll be able to welcome back soon.
Thanks for holding the fort. I've been talking to Professor Alam. There seems to be a glitch with his Wi-Fi. So what he's probably going to do
Oh,
is, yeah. So he's seeing there's some glitch. So what he's now doing is he's going to try and connect through his phone, because sometimes that just works, right, through the phone connection. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes, and
okay.
if he's able to join us, then well and good.
Do you, in
Otherwise,
the
we
meanwhile,
we might have.
do you want Abhik, while we are waiting for him, do you want to talk a little bit about the book without giving away much about your actual conversation?
Sure. Maybe depends.
Or,
Although
or
the
maybe,
viewers of the.
sorry.
Yeah. So I was thinking, Dipeshda, the viewers of our program need absolutely no sort of new introduction over and above what you've already said. But maybe I'll just add to what you said earlier when you introduced Professor Alam by mentioning some of his, classic landmark books, right? So, for example, his major publications include The Crisis of Empire in Mughal North India, also the Languages of Political Islam in India, 1200 to 1800, which you were referring to, Dipeshda, together with the several books that he has co-written with other scholars. For example, the celebrated book with Seema Alavi, A European Experience of the Mughal Orient, and the many celebrated books that he has co-authored together with Sanjay Subramanian. For example, The Mughal State, 1526 to 1750, then Writing the Mughal World, and last but not the least, there's also Indo-Persian Travels in the Age of Discovery, 1400 to 1800. And of course, the
I
whole
might actually.
emphasis. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say while Muzaffar is just. Muzaffar, you
I
may have
So
to
think
I
adjust the
have
angle so that your
is now there.
I'm
Muzaffar,
in
your
with
face,
my. Is it
we can see
okay?
you.
I'm here.
We
Yeah,
can
Can you
see you,
hear
but
just
me?
your face is getting cut off. Just
tilt,
tilt your phone a
tilt the
little bit
angle,
more.
tilt your phone a little bit so that your the whole, yeah,
Yes,
that's better.
perfect.
That's better. That's better.
Great.
No, I was just going to, before I sign off, I was just going to say that, see, Muzaffar and Sanjay together, but also Muzaffar's his own scholarship. I mean, they've been instrumental in
Again.
changing the nature of Mughal history. So we've lost him again.
Yeah. Yes, we seem to have lost him again. I think we'll have to tell him, not to move around, because sometimes there could be different areas of the house, right, where you get a bad signal patch or a
Right.
technical patch. Huh.
Right.
Okay.
Sorry.
Good.
Well,
All right.
let's hope
We seem to be
bounce
back.
back. Okay,
Okay,
that's
so
good,
I think
Muzaffar.
yeah.
Stay in that position. So Abhik, I'll take your leave now, and Muzaffar's
Yes.
to
Muzaffarji, don't
and,
move. Just
and
stay in that position. Just stay there. Just
Yes.
find a seat and stay
yeah,
there.
and,
Yeah.
yeah, and I will be listening
I'm
with a lot
so
of interest to your conversation. I'm going
yes.
off screen.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. All right. So, viewers, sorry about that technical glitch, and a very, very warm welcome to you to the
Okay.
inaugural episode, the first episode of season 2. And it's of course very befitting that this should feature, one of the world's most accomplished, easily the world's most learned today, and of course one of the world's most well-loved of medieval historians, Professor Muzaffar Alam Sahab. Muzaffar ji, adab, and a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Sorry for this my problem, internet problem. I had never experienced this. In fact, for a moment or for a minute, it has happened in the past, but nothing like that. I'm still trying, and my laptop is not getting.
No, that's fine. Muzaffarji, what I would suggest is let's leave the laptop aside and let's just continue our discussion like this. This is fine. This is absolutely fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So, Muzaffarji, in terms of the discussion of your recent book, The Mughals and the Sufis, Islam and Political Imagination in India, 1500 to 1750, which was published very recently to great acclaim. Why don't we perhaps get started with some of the popular notions or maybe stereotypes about the Sufis in India and their relationship to the monarchs? And for example, there's this notion that the Sufis were Aztecs. They were saintly, otherworldly beings who had absolutely no interest and completely shied away from anything to do with politics whatsoever, right? So perhaps we begin with that and share with us what your findings, what your research reveals.
Thank you, or for my being a little unnerved because of the internet connection. Yeah, I think that even today, many of our friends, including scholars, think that the Sufis' primary concern is the other world. Yes, primary concern is the other world. And I also think that if you consider the doctrinal discourses of the Sufis, they are discussing, you will find them discussing what, in fact, they would use the term tazkiyah nafs, that is purification of the soul, purifications of the heart, and much more sophisticated, much higher than that would be that their concern is not simply the life hereafter in the sense of Jannah or Jahannam, hell or heaven, but it is in fact the communion with Allah, communion with God. That is what Sufism is. And therefore, any concern with this worldly phenomena, everyday life, normal life, including politics of the court, simply pollutes piety. Because the aim is, the goal is piety, so it pollutes piety. But I would not say that all scholars, in fact, have gone or believe, in fact, the same. Many of my friends, and I would mention Simon Digby, for instance, he was one of the first. And around the same time, Aziz Ahmad, the author of the well-known book, Studies in Islamic Environment in Indian Islam in Indian Environment, Islamic Studies in Indian Environment, and our own very close friend who recently left us, Sunil Kumar, they did acknowledge, in fact, the Sufis' participations in politics. But in fact, the initiative in their participation in politics did not come from the Sufis. They were in fact forced to come, which also on occasions, in fact on many occasions, resulted in conflicts between the Sultan or the noble and the Sufis. They were forced to come. They were reluctant. What I have done, and where I think that I would not say that this is my invention or innovation, but I'm reasonably, in fact, different from my other friends and colleagues, is that Sufis here, I do not present the Sufis as passive receivers only. Their involvement in politics is very much active. As the sultans, the kings had their politics, their understanding of the statecraft, political management, so the Sufis also had their own understanding of politics. And it is, in fact, the relationship between the two, the interaction between the two, the Sufis' politics and the kings and the court politics or secular elites politics, that I have tried to understand. This is the difference. The king and the Sufis are in a sort of, I would say, if I am allowed to use this expression, in a sort of competition of power, in a competition of power, even in this world. And sometimes you will see in my, book, that the Sufi is more powerful. And sometimes, of course, most of the time, the king would dominate. The king would try to dictate, but the Sufi would refuse to be dictated. The Sufi will have their own strategy. This is what, in fact, the difference in my approach is from even those colleagues who have shown the Sufis taking part in politics. So this is how I would respond to.
Great.
Yeah.
And if we talk about the entire trajectory of the Mughal emperors, from, for instance, Babur all the way to Aurangzeb, another preconceived notion is that there's almost like a monolithic allegiance up until the time of Aurangzeb, as if all Mughal sultans were automatically they swore allegiance to the Chishtis or the Chishti Sabri. In your research, as you see the trajectory, not just maybe Babur, but even pre-Babur during the Timurid times, and the kind of allegiance and the kind of association they had to the different silsilas or sects of the Sufis through the ages. What does your book find in this regard?
Yeah, in terms of, it's a good question. And in terms of details and also the approach, the Mughals inherited a deeply rooted relationship with Sufis from their forebears. And the Mughals also saw the relationship between one set of the Sufis and the rulers whom they had overcome, whom they had defeated, the rulers, the Lodi king. Going back to Central Asia, from where the Mughals came, Babur's father was very close to one of the major 15th century Sufi, Naqshbandi Sufi, Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar. In fact, from him, we also have a branch in Naqshbandi, as we have a branch in India from Sheikh Ahmad Sarandi. We'll come to him later. When Babur was born, in fact, he was brought to his lap. He was there, in fact, in the palace with in Babur's father's, in fact, kingly palace, Umar Shaikh Mirza. And he suggested the name Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, Zahiruddin Muhammad. But since he thought that, and since this is how Abul Fazl reports in Akbarnama, that since the Chagtais were not, in fact, sophisticated enough to pronounce the Arabicized name so adequately, therefore, there was given also a short name, a short, Uzbek Perso Central Asian name, that is Babur. And we know, of course. And Babur did not, in fact, appropriate any other title. When he declared, when he was king, he called himself Muhammad Zahiruddin Babur. As you have, in fact, in the case of even earlier sultans, that when Iltutmish comes to power, he acquired a title of Shamsuddin, or when Balban comes to power, he acquires the title of Balban is what? I think, Jalaluddin Akbar. But at any rate, Islamic name with the Turkish name. Here, in fact, Babur has the same name. Now, Babur had a strong relationship. One of the expressions could be, of the manifestation could be that, all the Timurid princes dreamt to control Samarkand, because Samarkand was the center of Timur, and Timurid princes had this ambition. Babur also had this ambition, but he failed there. But whenever he would, of course, plan to, he will have in dream Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar, because by the time Babur grew, Khwaja Ubaidullah had died. And much more important is that he failed there, of course, but when he came over to India, when he defeated in the Battle of Panipat also, he had the vision of his master, that is the Timurid master, and his disciple as well, Naqshbandi Sufi. In between his relationship with his, with his ancestors, Sufi masters had strained a bit because of his being close to Shah Tahmasp Safavi. But then he repented and he came back to the fold of the same Central Asian Mawaran Nahri Naqshbandi Shayukh, Naqshbandi Peers. And, this is what is described. Babur. And then this, of course, is not given in Babur Nama. But in Babur Nama, this is interesting to note that when he is taken ill, he believes that if he versifies Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar's treatise, he would recover. And he says that the more he would, every day that he would, versify or translate into the Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar's treatise, and the more he will feel better. So that is one. And then it is also reported, and this, of course, Babur himself mentions, and Abul Fazl also mentioned, that he invited his master, that is Central Asian master Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar's descendants to India. That is a kind of, combined power. He has established a new Timurid kingdom in India, and in this Timurid kingdom, there will be also a share of the Harari Naqshbandi Shuyukh. But unfortunately, we know that Babur died, and Humayun. Uh, let's now go to Humayun. Humayun also had, of course, fascination for Sufism, but he became close to the Indian Sufi Shattaris because he was interested in astrological and astronomical features. I mean, those who are interested, they can read, in fact, in Qanun-e-Humayun, his interest. And therefore, and the Shattari also, amongst the prayers of the major parts of the prayers of Shattaris were Dua-e Dawati Asma-e Hasana, which in fact imply the control of the heavenly bodies and the stars. But of course, I'm not interested in those details. But so because of this, he became close to the Shattaris, and because of this, he became indifferent to those descendants of Khaja Abdullah Harar who had come, and they became, in fact, disgusted, and they left back. They left for Samarkand. And this is considered, in fact, by none other than one of his own cousins, Mirza Haidar Doghlab, that this became the cause of Humayun's defeat at the hands of the Afghans. So this, you can see, in fact, the nature of the interaction and relationship. And then when you come to Akbar, it is so evident because Akbar had his own vision of kingship. Akbar wanted to, in fact, appreciate the local because he grew. In fact, when he came to power, he was a young man, and then for some reasons, and I think we all know the details, he became connected matrimonially with one of the local important kingly families, Rajputs of Amer, later Jaipur, and so you have, for the first time, in a very organized manner, not for the first time, even Iltutmish had, in fact, a local Hindu princess as his queen. But here you have in a different. I will not go into the details of the nature of the matrimonial relationship that the Mughals established, and the significance of this relationship, that it is on equal footing. It is not that the conquerors brings the conquered peoples or the vanquished people's princess to his haram. It is actually matrimonial relationship with due respect to each other's traditions. So, all these conditions, in fact, convinced him of in considering a kind of a pattern of governance which would ensure closer relationship of the different, in fact, localities and different powers in the localities into Mughal Empire. This was a part, of course, his way of the building of the empire, imperial power. And with this vision, there was difficult for him. He found it difficult to reconcile with the Naqshbandi Ahrari, Central Asian Naqshbandi idea of no concern for the, or even opposition to the Rusume Biganegan, the customary practices of the others. There is no, in fact, compromise on this question, that if you want to become a good Muslim, you cannot, in fact, you should not take into account the cultural and social practices of the others. Otherwise, it will, in fact, affect the level of your own faith, your own Iman, your own Islam. Now, this was difficult. So therefore, and then luckily, therefore, you find that he is building relationship with the Chishtis. Amongst the manifestations of his relationship would be, first, of course, Khaja Salim Chishti of Agra, of Fatehpur Tikri, and then you have, in fact, his expressions of his devotion to Khaja Muinuddin Chishti. He would go on foot, visit the shrine of Khaja Muinuddin Chishti, and more than that, in fact, his appropriations of several Chishti practices, which in fact flowed from the Chishti belief in the doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud, that unity of being. That unity of being, very simplified, of course, implication would be that, since we are all one, so we can have, in fact, we can accommodate with each other. We can, in fact, have good relationship with each other. So this is how Akbar came close to the Chishti saints. And here, in fact, I would in fact mention, and I have repeatedly, in fact, I'm very fond of, repeating it, that while on the one hand, in the Naqshbandi, naturally, then of course, naturally, around the same time, towards the last years of Akbar's time, you have, in fact, a new branch of the Naqshbandi, Santalesian Naqshbandi, emerging from Sirhind, and under the leadership of Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi. And you have, in fact, Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi's own image of Mughal power, Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi's own image of Akbar, and the requirements of the politics and the nature of statecraft. So if on the one hand, and what is the result, that if on the one hand, in the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi, this branch is called Mujaddidi because Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi called himself the renovator of Islam in the second millennium. Millenarianism, in fact, a kind of millenarism, if there are any questions, because this millenarianism also affected in a measure Akbar Basha, and for that matter, two other Bashas in the Islamic land. But so in Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi's writings and in Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi's followers' writing, if you have the image of Akbar as quote unquote destroyer of Islam, Tahrib Islam, destroyer of Islam, it is interesting to note that in the Chishti Tazkira, one of the major Chishti Tazkira, that is Miratul Asrar, compiled by Sheikh Abdul Rahman Chishti, and I'll come to him later a bit, and if there are questions, much more. He mentions him as, when his name figures, of course, besides describing his connections with the Ajmer Shrine and the Chishti saints, he mentions him as Rahimahullah, God bless him. Now, this kind of formulated prayer is in fact meant for the pious people, for the Sufis, for religious scholars. So you can imagine the contrast of the image of the same ruler.
The same ruler between the Naqshbandis and the
Yes, in the two Sufi traditions. So that is something to be noted, in fact. And I'll come to. And after that, in fact, after Akbar, in Jahangir's time and in also Shah Jahan's time, the rulers were, and most of the nobles were, close to the Chishti primarily. But it does not mean that they were not patronizing the Naqshbandis, but they were not patronizing the local Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sarhandi. I'll come to his point when they returned to power, spiritual and also political power under Aurangzeb. But during these three rulers, the Naqshbandis, in fact, are pushed. I'm using this
almost marginalized.
Yes, they're marginalized. But the other Naqshbandis, of course, are still, in fact, earning patronage from the Mughal court, from the Mughal nobles, like the Dehbedi, Santalesian Naqshbandi. Dehbedi, in fact, a major branch of Naqshbandi, whom we generally forget, was there in Kashmir. So the Kashmiri Naqshbandis, and later also another branch which came up in Aurangabad, they are all in contact with the Mughals and the Mughal nobles because of their own, in fact, having shared the same homeland. You have, but the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi, they are almost alienated from the court during the time of Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan. We know that Jahangir, in fact, imprisoned Sheikh Ahmad Mujaddidi, and that, in fact, he uses a very strong word for Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi in his memoir, Preposterous Claim. And this is, of course, a theological debate. Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi has his own self-image as a Sufi, and this self-image was not acceptable even to the Muslim religious scholars of his time. And as they protested, and in response to their protest, Jahangir actually imprisoned Sheikh Ahmad Sarhandi, but within a year, in fact, he was released, and he stayed for some time at the court, but he didn't, of course, he stayed. Perhaps he would not have felt comfortable, and perhaps he would not have felt that he had to compete with the other Sufis at the court, so he left for. So this is. But then you come to Aurangzeb's time. In terms of details, Aurangzeb, in fact, it's difficult for me to say that Aurangzeb became a disciple of Naqshbandi saint. In his time, Sheikh Ahmad Sarandi's son, Sheikh Masoom Sarandi, was the major, in fact, leader of the Sarandi Sufis, Sarandi saints. And but we do have evidence of correspondence, not from, of course, the emperor's side. We do not have any letter from Aurangzeb to them, but you have several letters from Sheikh Masoom Sarandi to Aurangzeb and his brother, who died in 1661, Sheikh Muhammad Said Sarandi. Their letters to Aurangzeb and their instructions and exhortations for the things that Aurangzeb should do in order to re-establish Islam, in the sense of, the kind of the Islam that they thought. But we do not have enough evidence. It will be difficult for me to claim that we have evidence of Aurangzeb's having been completely integrated into Naqshbandi order as a disciple. We do not have any evidence like that. But the details that you have, I can suspect. But more important than that is that almost throughout Aurangzeb's time, you have one or the other member of the Naqshbandi, Sarandi, Mujaddidi family at the court. And one of the major, in fact, third Naqshbandi saint leader of the family, Khwaja Muhammad Naqshband, in fact, is reported to be there during the time of Aurangzeb's military expeditions against Golconda regime. And I have, in fact, given interesting details. In fact, slightly funny also, because this is described by one of the major poets of the time, Nemat Khan Ali. And he, in fact, describes the claims of the Naqshbandi Sheikh, Khwaja Muhammad Naqshband, and also the nature of his influence on Aurangzeb, rather sarcastically. So that you have. And the second, in fact, interesting and perhaps I would say indisputable evidence of Aurangzeb's close connections with the Naqshbandi family is that what, in fact, our Suniti Kumar Chatterjee, in one of his articles, which is, of course, philological primarily, relating to language and linguistics, describes that one of our Bengal fellow who had heard about Aurangzeb's, in fact, concern with religion and religiosity, and he had come all the way from Bengal to the Deccan of course, during this time in the 80s, Aurangzeb was already in the Deccan fighting against the Marathas and also and he wanted to become murid of Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb, of course, when he was brought to the court, Aurangzeb smiled and he said that I'm just an ordinary person and my concern is primarily secular and political, that is this worldly, and take him to Muhammad Nafe Sarandi. So unfortunately, we do not have anywhere else this name except in Muzaffar Alam Gil. That's the political chronicle. It's not the Naqshbandi Tazkira. And so that shows, and in fact, there the primary interest of Suniti Kumar Chatterjee is that Aurangzeb was familiar with Hindi and with Sanskrit, and he mentioned a couple of things which, if you are interested, and if anyone of my friends is interested, can read it, because he thinks that Aurangzeb also knew Sanskrit, and Aurangzeb certainly knew very good Hindi, and that is clear. He would prefer, in fact, to speak Hindi, and in Hindi means whatever the form of Hindi in the 17th century. But he and I am reminded of, and I would mention this, that one of the varieties of mango that Aurangzeb liked very much, he called it Sudharas. Sudharas.
Yes.
So, Suniti Babu, in fact, suggests that nobody can think of such a beautiful, name uh, uh, unless he knows or he has
They have
some
a
idea
deep,
of,
yes, a deep
something.
knowledge, a deep,
Yeah.
not just a working knowledge, but a deep knowledge of the
Yeah.
language.
Yeah. So now,
Muzaffarji,
in fact, so this is what the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi came back to the court in Aurangzeb's time, and and of course there are several manifestations of their coming back to the court and a kind of competition between the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi and the Chishtis, and I will come to it later. Perhaps there could be also a question I see here from
yes.
you. So I think this is what I would say for the moment.
So Muzaffarji, staying with Aurangzeb for a minute, regardless of whether he was a true disciple or truly swayed by the Naqshbandi order and their philosophy, or whether he portrayed this allegiance for his political reasons, right? For his own stakes in the kingdom and the empire. One of the things is undisputed, and you've pointed this out in your book, is that his aversion. So Aurangzeb, is brought up in a milieu where there is music. There is definitely music in the court of Shah Jahan. But when he comes to power as the Emperor Alamgir, there is a dictum against music or against sama, and this reaches beyond the confines of the court, even to the silsilas or even to the khankas in the various orders. And there is this particular, I think, very telling, very dramatic incident that you have recounted in your book, where there's a particular silsila, right? And you have the Mu'tasib who orders them to stop the musical performance. And after that, what happens. So it would be great if you could share that with us, with the viewers.
Yeah, that's very interesting story, and this comes out, of course, from the Sufi Taskira, and I would not take much time. In fact, I will read out the passage from my book. It's a long passage, but part of it which would be of interest in it. The background is this: that uh, during the time of Urs, that is the birth or the death celebrations of the saint, Khwaja Bakhtiyar Kaki, Khaja Bakhtiyar Kaki, who is buried in Mehroli, in Delhi. One of the major Chishti saints of the time, who lived and who was very closely connected with Sheikh Abdul Quddus Gangohi. In fact, I should have mentioned that how relationship of the Mughals, in fact, shifted from a kind of rivalry or conflict between the Chishti, and so I'll come to this if there is any question. So one of his descendants, he would come on the occasion of the Urs celebration of Bakhtiyar Kaki to Delhi, and he will organize Sama, that is Qawwali, this music audition party, which is in fact, which is allowed in Chishtis, in fact, which is considered to be, in fact, a major spiritual, practice, while this is completely banned. There is no, of course, in the 18th century, there are flexibilities and
Yes.
accommodations. That's a different question. But, in the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi traditions, there is no permissions for Sama, for audition party, for music. So this is, he would come, and this Sufi, his name is Khwaja Gharibullah. Now, Khwaja Gharibullah, he figures, in fact, in the Sufi Tazkira, and I give you the story from Sawati-ul Anwar, which is, of course, a major Chishti Tazkira of the late 17th century, around 86, 87, it was compiled. So he would come, and he had, from the time of Shah Jahan, so he had met Shah Jahan, and he had also met Dara Shikoh, and he did not have any trouble. He would, in fact, be welcome, and he would organize and sponsor this audition party. And after the, completion of the celebrations, the ceremony of Khaja Bakhtiyar Kaki's Urs, he'll go back. This was the routine. But what happened that in Aurangzeb's time, you have now a new institutions of Muhtasib. that is a kind of daroga, a police
Yes.
officer, who would take care of the extent of your adherence to Sharia. So that was the role of the muhtasib. And from the text, this text that I'm citing from to you, it appears that this muhtasib around this time, this is in the 70s. The story relates sometimes around the 70s. 70s means the 70s of
1670s. Yes.
1676, 77, 75. The exact year is not given. Now, so the muhtasib, in fact, is identified as Pir Zada. Whosoever is muhtasib, he is a Pir Zada. That is, he comes from a important Sufi family. Now,
Right.
no Pir Zada, Chishti Pir Zada, you can imagine to be muhtasib. Chishti, of course, allow you to be. No Qadri, because by this time the Qadri Sufis are also fairly, in fact, widespread Qadri Sufi
Yes.
order. So I
Qadri,
would,
Sabri, they would not partake of this.
and I would assume, in fact, this muhtasib must be a Pirzada from Sarandi family. And in fact, I'll give you also one very stretched sort of evidence for my speculation. Now, what happens that he was reported that the same Khaja Gharibullah, he has come now and he has organized this audition party. Of course, it was, in his understanding, against the Sharia, it was violation of Sharia. So therefore, he sent a message that you stop this audition party. No longer it will be allowed here in this city, in Delhi,
Yes.
because Mehroli is a part of Delhi. So, but of course, the Sufi, he had come all the way from Saharanpur area, Gango area, and so it would not be stopped. But then he threatened that I will come and I will force you to stop it.
Yes.
So this message came, and the music party was on, and naturally, so I will read this. The report then goes that when this muhtasib, when this Sayyid, that is this fellow, the Sufi, heard of the approach towards the Sama party of that Pirzada muhtasib, and when he found the other participants having been very panicky amongst his own disciples, so he thought that he should now consult the great master, that is Khaja Bakhtiyar Kaki, under whose shrine the party was being organized. Yeah. So he sought Bakhtiyar Kaki's advice. Thereupon, he saw the saint's grave splitting down the middle, and Bakhtiyar Kaki himself emerged in red robes, fire-colored red robes, reciting the following verse. I give you the translation. Attired in red-colored apparel, he, the beloved, is riding a rapid steed. Beware, O friends, for the fire has risen high. Now, Gharibullah took this to mean that Sheikh Kaki wants him and his followers to resist and combat.
Mm-hmm.
Totally entranced and inspired with Kaki's message, the Sheikh then stood and he started dancing. That Chishti Sufi also, in fact, the Rakh is also besides the music with the Sama. And in the meanwhile, of course, the Qawwals, of course, he asked the Qawwals to repeat whatever he was singing. And the song was so beautiful that he says, of course, the Chishti, that even the Muhtasib Pirzada, when he came, he was also intoxicated. But at any rate, he forced him to stop. And it was not simply that the party was stopped, he was asked to leave the city. So Gharibullah had to leave Delhi. And but even as he left the city, and this is interesting,
yes,
he declared that the emperor, because of whom this Muhtasib had the power of stopping the audition party, upon whose instance the Pirzada had acquired so much of power. So he said that the emperor too would be forced to leave Delhi. So it happened. So it was, in fact, this party, this
prophecy
relates to 1675, 76.
Yes.
And it so happened that by 1980, 81, Aurangzeb had to leave Delhi. and poor man never returned to Delhi.
Never returned.
He died there. The capital city, to capture of which he imprisoned his own father. The capital city to capture, or the power in the representation of the power is Delhi, of course, Delhi and Agra. To capture of which power, of the power for which
he kills his own brothers.
He deceived his own brothers. Forget about Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh, of course, was his rival. But even, Murad Bakhsh, poor Murad Bakhsh was not forgiven. And he promised Murad Bakhsh
the throne to Murad Bakhsh.
I'm not interested in political power.
I'm a Sufi.
I'm a Sufi. I'm primarily a religious person.
Yes.
So that man, he dreamt to be back to Delhi, but he never returned to Delhi. He died. He died in the Deccan. Of course, and this is also, in fact, an irony of the fact that he was buried in the enclosure of a Chishti Sufi there in Fuldabad, near Aurangabad. That is interesting. And you have such stories of competition. This is, of course, with reference to Muhtasib. There are also, in fact, another Qazi who wanted to interfere in a party, not here in Delhi city, but not in Delhi city, but in some other cities. I think it is near a town near Karnal and Panipat, and he too, in fact, suffered, and because of his interference, his tongue, in fact, he lost.
Yes, he becomes mute. He becomes, yes.
So you have such. So what I would like, in fact, I'm reading from such stories the fact I'm using the word the fact that even amongst the Sufis there is a competition to have political power.
Yes.
So it's in fact this manifestation of holding Sama party in Delhi and not wanting anybody to interfere in your party means that you have some power in Delhi. You should have some power. And you did not approve of interference. That is, so this is what I in fact, and I have given such stories in the introduction and also in the footnotes. And this one, of course, is in the main text. Yes, please.
Indeed. Muzaffarji, just anecdotally, the last time that we were talking, even the Muhtasib, who may have been of the Naqshbandi denomination, who had forcibly evicted the Khwaja, I think even he dies, right?
Yes.
Even he dies.
Yeah, he also died. And therefore, my suspicion is that this could be Khaja Muhammad Saifuddin, Sheikh Muhammad Saifuddin, Sheikh Muhammad Masum's son, because he died prematurely around the same time.
Right, so they could be one and the same.
And he was very close to Aurangzeb. In fact, he was deputed by his father, Sheikh Muhammad Masum, to take care of the orders, proper, in fact, arrangement and instructions at the court. And he also, in fact, was given the responsibility to select one of the harams, one of the princes. I'll come to that, to get access into the interior of the royal palace.
Yes.
So this is, yes.
So on that note, Muzaffarji, let us maybe shift our lens and go from the Diwan-e-Am, the Diwan-e-Khas into the Zenana. And one of the I think very revealing and astute essays that you have in your book is to compare from the perspective of religious theological allegiance, particularly with respect to Sufi silsilas, the two royal imperial princesses who are both daughters and Sahibain, sisters of each other, Jahanara Begum on the one hand, Roshanara Begum on the other, and their niece, Zeb-un-Nisa. Because most of the time, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, much of the philosophical discourse, the theological discourse, and also the historical analysis has been around Akbar, pre-Akbar, post-Akbar, to an extent Majalis-e Jahangiri, and to an extent, all right, so 2-3 generations down the line, how does that affect Dara Shikoh? How does that impact him? How does that shape his philosophical or mystical output? But very, very few people have concentrated on the women of the imperial palace. And this is something that you've done beautifully. I want you to share with our viewers what your findings are.
Yeah, yes. In fact, I worked and I feel that I worked really very hard. And I could not have, of course, covered all the princes, Mughal princes in India, that is from Gulbadan Begum down to Zebun Nisa. But in fact, and I selected only the princes who saw Aurangzeb's time, and also because you can see why I did so, and also who were contemporaries of Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. So my interest in Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb, you can see this. So yes, since in my understanding, Mughal politics, you cannot appreciate Mughal politics if you do not do the Sufi politics or the Sufi taskiras closely. And since Mughal politics is, in fact, not limited only to the male apartments, to the main court, the Mughal politics was also very much, in fact, formulated, shaped, and revised inside the harem. Therefore, I thought that I should certainly discuss, at least briefly, the harem politics and the Sufi relationship. I do not have to, in fact, go into the details that the Mughal princes, right from Timur's time, they had their own voice. In fact, my friend reminds me of even the Subaltern Speaks, this article by Gayatri Spivak. So they had their own voice. Timur's wife, in fact, she would organize the parties of drinking parties to the ambassadors on her own, where you do not have even Timur. And when Shah Rukh Mirza died, Shah Rukh Mirza's queen, in fact, she took care of managing the state and inviting the nobles and the princes. And so there is a tradition and of interference, very, very evident interference from the harem. And you have in India, of course, Gulbadan Begum, and much more than Gulbadan Begum, in fact, Maryam Zamani in Akbar's time. And also you have much more, where I do not have to give the details, Nur Jahan, to the extent that Nur Jahan junta, you have that. It was primarily Nur Jahan who was the ruler. Jahangir's interest was primarily just, to relax and drink and poetry and literature. So therefore, I do not have to establish first that how much the Mughal princes were involved in politics and in forming and in shaping the politics. So I took, in fact, three princes primarily, and in fact, and the reason, of course, is that all these three princes, in one way or the other, in my understanding, have not been given due attention. I start with Jahanara. Jahanara, of course, you have several writings right from the late 19th century on Jahanara, and even today, recently, a couple of biographies, monographs on Jahanara. But Jahanara's primary text, in which you have the personality of Jahanara reflected, and in which you have her Sufistic claims, and claims, of course, of her, in fact, role in the Timurid dynasty, that is Sahibiya, a kind of autobiographical account. This has not been properly analyzed. So I thought that I should read it closely. So I started, of course, with Jahanara's writings, her letters to Aurangzeb and the politics, etc., 28 letters to Aurangzeb, and thereby how it, in fact, reflects and gives you an idea of the nature of conflict between Aurangzeb and the court, which was dominated, according to Aurangzeb's understanding, by Dara Shikoh, because of Dara Shikoh being so close to Shah Jahan. I then came to Sahibiya. And in Sahibiya, I analyzed Sahibiya very closely. And three things, in fact, comes out from my reading of Jahanara, which is, in fact, very significant. First, that Jahanara calls herself that she was direct disciple of Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti. Jahanara lived in the 17th century. Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti lived in late 12th century, 400 years earlier. Now, this is, in fact, in Sufi terminology, this is called Owaisiyat. And this, in fact, relates to Khwaja Owais Qarni, who could not, in fact, meet the Prophet, but accepted Islam, and Prophet appreciated because of his mother's illness, etc. So anybody who does not have, in fact, the direct, mushahada, direct meeting with the master, but still the master is guiding him or her, is Owaisi. So she calls herself Owaisi. let me use this, in fact, common parlance expression. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry cannot claim that he is an Owaisi, even amongst the Sufis. If he or she claims that, he will be laughed at. Here, Jahanara is taken very seriously, as we know. So
There's
that
a
is
direct, so it's like a direct personal relationship with that master.
with the master, and it's not an ordinary master. He is, in fact, the greatest of the Chishti masters in India. In fact, to the extent that he's called even the Nabi-e-Hind, the prophet of India. So this is one. The second thing is that she eventually, in fact, she is in search of the living pir, and she looks for some chishtis. She's not satisfied. She looks also for some padri. By this time, the padris are very much prominent in Mughal India. And finally, she gets, of course, at the advice of her brother, to whom he was very close, Dara Shikoh. I will not, in fact, emphasize that how much she is in love with Dara Shikoh. She likes Dara Shikoh as a scholar. She likes Dara Shikoh as a Sufi. So, but she says expressly that she would herself, in fact, check and test whether he deserves to be her master.
Which is unheard of, right? Which is unimaginable.
Which by a woman, of all the person, by a woman. The third thing, which is more important, is that finally because she all the time, she is very much anxious to know more about, this is Mullah Shah Badakshi, who was, of course, Dara Shikoh's Piro Murshid. Yes. And finally, she saw in dream Prophet Muhammad along with the companions. And it is not the first time, of course, only Prophet Muhammad and his companions. Second time, she also saw Prophet Muhammad and sitting at his feet, Mullah Shah Badakshi. Now this, in fact, and then Prophet Muhammad instructing Mullah Shah Badakshi, which implies that you have, in fact, been a master of this time or something. Why don't you integrate her also? And this will illumine the dynasty. Now, so she, in fact, the self-image is that now that it is not simply at Dara Shikoh's, in fact, advice, but she got instructions and direction direct from the Prophet, which is not an ordinary position, even for a pious Muslim, let alone, of course, I'm not meaning denigrations, let alone for a woman. So this is the second thing. Third is that even after she became a disciple of Mullah Shah Badakshi, when she visits a shrine of Khaja Muhammad Khaja Muinuddin Chishti, the kind of the language that she uses is, in fact, to be noted, which shows that so simultaneously with two peers, that's very rare, in fact. That is allowed in certain circumstances, but that is very rare. And finally, that she desired that she should be buried in the precincts of Khaja Nizamuddin Awliya. So and
Muzaffarji, just anecdotally, even earlier when she was badly burnt in that accident and she was recovering, there are periods of time where she would actually go to Ajmer Sharif, or she would be at the shrine of Khwaja Chishti.
Yes. Yeah. So
by the time she was already a disciple of Mullah Shah, but even then, when she had that accident and she was recovering, and she would spend time there at the shrine.
He is simultaneously a Qadri and a Chishti, which is very rare. That position you cannot accord even to the greatest of the great princes who claim to be the greatest of the great Sufis, that is Dara Shikoh. I'll come to this point, that how Dara Shikoh, in fact, considered to be the highest, even amongst the Sufis of his time, and power, combining political power and spiritual truth. So this is, in fact, interesting in her case. That shows her confidence. That shows, her. And in fact, she, in fact, mentioned Rabia Basriya, one of the undisputed, in fact, Sufi masters, women Sufi masters of early Islam. And implication is that she herself is the Rabia Basriya of her own time. So I would not go into, in fact, the verses that she is also a poet, not, of course, a major poet like her niece Zebul Nisa. So this is one. The second, in fact, the second princess that I selected is Roshan Ara or Roshan Rai. You know that about Roshan Rai from the European account that from European accounts about all the princes, but about Roshan Rai, Roshan Ara in particular, the debauchery, that she would not be satisfied and that she sleeps with one man or two men in the same night, etc. Or in the political chronicles that you have, she is in fact projected as somebody very close to Aurangzeb, virtually spying for Aurangzeb, agent of Aurangzeb in the court, and she is a rival of Jahanara. She hates Dara Shikoh, which is of course correct, and in fact she took initiative in Dara Shikoh's execution. Uh, After Aurangzeb came to power, and or at best the expression will be that the nobles would come to her palace. Aurangzeb, in fact, awarded him very, generously after he came to power, and she, in fact, demonstrated her power like a real powerful prince. These things you have, but nowhere you have any hint of her association with the spirituality. So that is, in fact, perhaps I have not read. I'm the first person. I may be absolutely, maybe there will be questions and objections. I'm the first person to show her as the real Naqshbandi Mujaddidi saint of her own time. And the kind of the letters that she writes, not simply that the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi saint, Khaja Saifuddin, who was deputed to take care of the royal haram and royal court by his father, Sheikh Muhammad Masum Sarandi, but also the letters and the kind of the questions that she raises in her letters too. Or, of course, it's not her letters, but the saint, of course, repeats whatever she had written. The question that she asks shows a very high stature in spirituality. And the second thing is that, I will not go into these details, how did she die, but her connections with, of course, Khaja Masum Sarandi has been shown even by some of our architecture historian that the tomb of Khaja Masum Sarandi was financed and built and supervised by Roshan Ara. And in fact, you have the evidence of and manifestations of the Mughal architecture, Mughal style of decorations in Khaja Masum's of tomb in Sirhind. But the stature that you get in the Naqshbandi text of her is higher, even higher than her sister Jahanara. Nowhere Jahanara claims that she is a Khalifa, that she can also initiate. Khalifa means that a disciple who has been permitted by the master to behave like a master and to initiate the others.
She calls herself a Fakira, right? She calls herself Fakira.
Of course, I mean, Fakira, of course, this is a like Darvish,
Yes.
Yes. Even otherwise, she was the richest.
Fakira is being humble, right? No way you're humble, saying you're a master, it's humble.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, even if she was the richest princess of her time, and Aurangzeb, in fact, yes, Aurangzeb allowed, in fact, all the jagirs that she had, all the properties that she had to remain with her. And she lived, in fact, a very beautiful palace in Delhi. So, yes, but this Roshan Ara, in fact, is allowed to behave like a real spiritual master, Khalifa in Mujaddidi, Naqshbandi, Sarhandi traditions for the women inside the haram. No, that's something which nobody has, in fact, noted. Maybe that because people thought that these are just the rants of the Sufi saints. But this shows actually the Sufi, Naqshbandi, Sarhandi, Mujaddidi Sufi, once they get access to the court of Aurangzeb, their effort and their ambitions to get access inside the haram in order to completely cover,
monopolize their sovereignty, their power, right? Their grip, their control.
And you have the manifestations of this kind of relationship with Aurangzeb of the Mujaddidi Naqshbandi Sarhandi Mujaddidi Naqshbandi in the politics of the time, in the politics of the 18th century, and including, of course, the decline and the alienations of the non-Muslims. Of course, I mean, it's not alienation in the sense as many people would think the Rajputs are still fighting with Aurangzeb, but we know that Rajputs were not very happy with Aurangzeb, and and of all, in fact, the imposition of jizya, which is so the hated jizya, because there is no justification even in Islamic Sharia. But according to these one or the other Sunni tradition, perhaps, at least to humiliate, if nothing else, to humiliate. So that is, these are the two, especially, in fact, posts that were created in Aurangzeb's time, Muhtasim, and also Amile Jazia, the collect, Amine Jazia. Yes, so that is, and the third, of course, is Zebun Nisa. I give a special attention to Zebun Nisa primarily for two reasons. One, that I am very much fascinated by her poetry, which of course is considered to be, in fact, fake, at least not every ghazal, but at least the divan, that particular volume of which is known as Diwan-e-Makhfi, because her pen name is Makhfi, Takhallus is Makhfi. So I wanted to, in fact, see what is her evaluations in amongst her contemporaries. So I selected first, of course, her own mentor and tutor, Ashraf Mazandarani, an Iranian, one of the major poets of the 17th century, who has a divan. And I just went through, browsed through the poems which he wrote for Zebun Nisa, and which were dedicated, or which had one or the other connection in terms of the events which took place and where Zebun Nisa figured, and the kind of the adjectives that he uses. I will not go into the details. But suggest that she is highly talented. She is one of the best literate. She is also a poet, and there is a poem which also hints that perhaps her own divan was in fact drawn because of the error of one of her mates in the pond in the house or in the tank, and that is also interesting, because each and every word that could have meant for Ashraf Mazandarani, how he describes that. So that is. Then, in fact, that there were several makhfis, the general understanding among the historians, and this, of course, came out from our great Jadunath Sarkar, because he, like a real, Rankian, he said that first time you have evidence of Zebun Nisa being, in fact, a poet with the name of Makhfi or Takhallus of
So many
Makhfi,
decades after
16,
her
70
death.
years. In
Yes.
the Tazkira of Bhagwan Das Hindi, which is called Tazkira Hindi, or there you have a paragraph, or in Gule Rana of Lakshmi Rana and Shafiq. There is no evidence from her own time. But here is a person, in fact, one, of course, Ashraf Mazandarani himself, but the fact that her pen name was Makhfi, comes out so clearly from a few lines of Marcia mourning, that elegy that a Mughal official wrote. His name is Champat Rai, and he also was tutored, and his poetry was corrected by Ashraf Mazandarani. He was also one of the pupils of Ashraf Mazandarani, and you have, in fact, the manuscript, these manuscripts of these lines, and also the letters that he exchanged after the death of Princess Zebun Nisa with Ashraf Mazandarani, who had left by this time for Iran. He himself died, actually, this Ashraf Mazandarani, in 1704. And there you have, he's playing with the word Makhfi, and is clearly, and he also, in fact, uses an expression, Khusruwe Mulke Sohan. In the country, in the domain of the speech, in the domain of poetry, she was the king. Now, how can you call anyone, the king of, or, of the domain of speech and
Of poetry.
poetry, if she or he is not
An
a
accomplished
person
poet.
who could have? So therefore, I think that is this Diwan-e-Makhfi. It is possible that there may have been some interpolations, there may have been some ghazals or some poems by some other poets, but several poems from the spirit, from the content of the poems and the spirit of the poem, you can guess that would have come from Zebun Nisa, because Zebun Nisa does not approve of also Aurangzeb's politics, because if she was the dear daughter of her father, and if she would be accompanying her father everywhere that Aurangzeb would go, she was eventually imprisoned because of her suspected association with Muhammad Akbar, who rebelled
And his
against
rebellion,
against
yes.
against Aurangzeb, because of Aurangzeb's, in fact, indifference, at least, if not hostility to Rajputs. And in fact, one of the interpretations of Aurangzeb's leaving Delhi is that he left Delhi chasing Muhammad Akbar. And you know that in Mughal chronicles, after Muhammad Akbar's rebellion, his name is given Abtar. That is the one who has gone down, who has been insulted and humiliated, who has been
Yes. And I was just wondering, right? I mean, would it be
so
fair to say that
so I
philosophically,
yes so
Zebun Nisa,
I would sum up this part
mhm,
that, I have not, of course, established that she is the author of this Diwan-e Makhfi,
mhm,
but I
mhm,
certainly believe that she is one of the a major eminent poets of her time. She is one of the highly literate and talented persons, and it's not that she patronized it's not that she patronized only. She patronized the compilations of several important books like Zebut Tafasir, the Persian version of one of the greatest, in fact, Quranic commentaries by Imam Razi, Fakhruddin Imam Razi's Tafsir Kabir, which is called Zebut Tafasir. She patronized and funded one of her own associates to go to Makkah and write about his travel, which is the first of its kind from India, Anisul Hujjaj. So she is not simply that. She is a great scholar of her time. She is one of the great poets of her time, and but she suffered at the hands of Aurangzeb. And therefore, I chose, in fact, in this article, one ghazal, which in fact, suggests that how she is different from Aurangzeb, how she is actually addressing her own father from prison.
uh,
And yeah, there are also
Muzaffarji,
a couple of
Muzaffarji, of that particular ghazal, do you have the Persian original with you right now? Would you like to
no,
read out if you
I'm
have that?
sorry, I do not have, because I do not have Divan with me. So I'm
Okay,
sorry, I do not have. Yes.
okay.
So that is
So,
yeah, and the thing is that Aurangzeb. I mean, as I told you, that Aurangzeb is very fond of. He may or may not have been completely associated with only Naqshbandi Mujaddidi, but his orientation by temperament is the same as any Mujaddidi Naqshbandi sheikhs, and he is a dry Sharia man, dry theologian Sharia man, and therefore he encouraged and funded Fatawa Alamgiri, etc. Fiqh, his interest is in fiqh. Even if he violated the fiqh, when he reimposed the jizya, he violated the fiqh. He did not act according to the fiqh. But the thing is that he all the time aspires that all the members of the family should be associated with the Mujaddidi Sarhindi. And he also asked the Mujaddidi Sarhindi sheikhs to persuade, when she is in prison in Delhi and he is in the Deccan, to persuade Zebul Nisa, as I will understand, to in fact forgive, to seek forgiveness of her father. And but Zebul Nisa, of course, would retort back to the letters that she got from one of the major Naqshbandi. In fact, that is also very interesting. His name is Sheikh Abdul Ahad Wahdat, who himself is a Persian poet, and he also wrote in Hindavi, and his Hindavi pen name is Gul, which means flower. And we have a couple of 3 4 letters of him, which is full of, in fact, very literary, very difficult language, very literary, very poetic, and where again he hints that you are a poet, therefore you should understand. And of course, the discussion is not about her politics or Aurangzeb's politics. The discussion is on what, in fact, pathos is, what gham is, and that is, of course, pure literary discussion. So all this shows uh, that or Zebul Nisa's stature, and it also shows, and therefore I emphasize this, and I took particular interest in these letters. It also shows that amongst the Naqshbandis also, you do not have simply the pure Sharia-oriented Sufis. Sharia-oriented, yes, but there are also poets and figures of men of literature whose influence, because of whose influence or because of whose association with the literary figures of Delhi in the 18th century, you have, in fact, the Naqshbandi saints, Naqshbandi doctrine, Naqshbandi orientation of Sharia very much in vogue in Delhi. Even if there are, of course, variations, accommodations, revision, like for instance, Sheikh Mirza Mazhar Jan Janan, who is a Naqshbandi Mujaddidi, but you know the story, and I would not repeat this story, that how he, in fact, he projects Lord Krishna or Lord Rama when a dream is related in the Khanqa of his master, Sufi master, and who thinks that this is, of course, that Rama and Lord Krishna, they are in the fire, and so the fire is interpreted as hellfire, and Lord Krishna is in the middle of the hellfire, and Rama is on the sitting on the margins, and this one fellow says that this is the hellfire. Then Mirza Mazhar Janan would say, no, this is not hellfire, this is the fire of love, and the love, of course, is divine love, and Lord Krishna, in fact, represents the depth of divine love, while Rama, of course, has also many other concerns. So, there are, of course, revisions and changes. And even in Naqshbandi Silsila, I have shown it in the introduction. I did not discuss it primarily in any chapter. Later in the 19th century and even early 20th century, you have some saints, Sufi saints who remain Hindu, despite the fact that the Sufi wanted that now I should accept Islam because I believe in these social and spiritual practices of the Naqshbandi Silsila. So the master said no. And this in fact, you can connect to Mirza Mazhar Janjana through Bahraich line. I do not remember all the details. So this is what I would say in response very briefly. Yes.
Muzaffarji, there is another theme that we absolutely have to explore, without which this discussion would be incomplete. Because we talked about Jahan Ara Begum, Roshan Ara Begum, Zeb-un-Nisa. We've talked about from Babur to Akbar, definitely at great depth on Aurangzeb. We haven't as yet spoken about Dara Shikoh. And that is absolutely critical for this discussion, because I personally, when I read it, in my humble opinion, it is easily the most imaginative and the most astute of all the essays, and of many such essays that I would have read. And I'm sure many of the viewers, once they read the book, or whoever has read the book, would agree with me. Because for generations, from the time of his panegyrist Abul Fazl up way into, maybe until this point, right? There has hardly been any disputation. There's been a lot of disputation about Akbar's politics, but hardly any disputation that when it comes to the pluralistic, syncretic ethos of Mughal history or the entire Islamic period, amongst monarchs, amongst sultans, Akbar is at the pinnacle. And what your analysis, what your research shows, is not just a very, very keen and observant analysis or examination of the evolution of Dara Shikoh as a scholar, as a theologist, as a chronicler, as a philosopher, but also comparing, I wouldn't use the word contrast, but comparing his ideals and his framework, if I may use the term, of political kingship, and comparing that with that of Akbar. So if you would share with us your findings, particularly in the context of the translation from the Sanskrit of Yog Vasisht.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, and this is something which I did. And I also, in fact, rather arrogantly, I thought that perhaps the earlier analysts and earlier essays on Yoga Vasishta did not take into considerations something very important in the Persian Yoga Vasishta, and particularly of Dara Shikoh's, which in fact we have in Dara Shikoh. The first thing, in fact, I must make it absolutely clear that I do not contrast, and maybe that I have used some words which might be giving this impression. I do not say that Dara Shikoh is ahead of. After all, Dara Shikoh lived, in fact, so many years, so many decades after Akbar, and Dara Shikoh is in Akbari line, So he must, of course, if he is bright, if he is intelligent, if he thinks about the society and environment around him close, seriously, then he must be, in fact, suggesting. So therefore, of course, in this respect, he's certainly ahead of Akbar. And in the second thing is that uh, that I feel that Dara Shikoh, in fact, I started that why Dara Shikoh is keen to retranslate Yoga Vasishta, because by the time Dara Shikoh was there, you have several translations of Yoga Vasishta. Yoga Vasishta, of course, Laghu Yoga Vasishta, not, of course, the Brihad Yoga Vasishta.
But he's dissatisfied.
Yes, the first one, of course, is Nizam Panipati's, which was commissioned in Akbar's time and which was very closely supervised by Jahangir, and then second, of course, is Abul Qasim Findarsky. There are several, but these two, Abul Qasim Findarsky, of course, is a kind of essay, and he analyzes. He does not, in fact, follow each and every word, and he integrates several verses in the interpretation. He writes extremely beautiful prose, which in fact is very intoxicating. And then you have also the summarized version of Yoga Vasishta as a pure book of tasawwuf by Sufi Qutb Jahani, which is called Hallul Asrar, Atwar Dar Hall Asrar, which is not, of course, even Laghu Yoga Vasishta. It is because in this you have 10 chapters, while in Laghu Yoga Vasishta you have 6 chapters perhaps. So that could be, in fact, Yoga Vasishta Sar or something based on Yoga Vasishta Sar. But, Dara Shikoh, in fact, he invites the Brahmins of his time, and he plans to have his own translation. Why? My feeling is that Dara Shikoh saw that something very critical is there in Yoga Vasishta, which has been missed out. And what is that? That Yoga Vasishta is not simply a book on tasawwuf, a book on Vedant, a book on philosophy. The philosophy, pure spiritualism, and it does not represent simply spiritual truth. The Laghu Yoga Vasishta also has a full discussions about what should be the statecraft, what should be the nature of political management, what is the ideal of governance in particular, of course. And then he becomes particularly interested because he is also aspiring to become ruler. He is also, because he is, that he engaged in the battle of, succession battle. So he, and then he sees also something that is, of course, and therefore this kind of comes out, this particular message that this is something which has been missed out right at the beginning of the translation, which is attributed to Dara Shikoh, which was in fact supervised or advised, by Dara Shikoh.
Yes.
I mean, I won't go into the details how much he knew Sanskrit and whether he is direct translator or he simply edited, and certainly edited and supervised. That is two things. One, right at the beginning, there is a question by Bhardwaj to Valmiki. And the question is that if Ram is such a high figure in his spirituality, then how is it that he managed the Sultanate? It's only in Dara Shikoh's translation that the word Sultanate right at the beginning. In fact, the first chapter, you have, in fact, this expression. So the entire book then is, in fact, a kind of solution, a kind of analysis of what should be the best way of blending the political power, with the spiritual truth. So that is one. And the second story is also important. Even if this is not as expanded as Nizam Panipati's translation, which is word to word of Laghu Vasishta, but he gives the story. He in fact picks up from the other important Brahmanical texts. And he gives the story, particularly at the beginning of the confrontation between Vishwamitra and Vasishtha Muni. That's very important. And Vishwamitra, in fact, you know that Vishwamitra actually visited, and he wanted Raja Ramchandra, Prince Ramchandra, to come to the rescue of the sages in the jungle, who are being, in fact, troubled by the demons, and then, of course, I mean, I won't go into the detail. And then, of course, he meets Vasishtha Muni, and he reminds him of Brahma's solutions of the problems that he had faced once. And that then comes the Kamdhenu story, that, because Vishwamitra is a prince, he is a Raja, and he comes to Vasishtha Muni, and Vasishtha Muni invites him, and he gets very jealous that how it is that, he's just an ordinary Brahman, and so he wants to become like Vasishtha Muni. And then he realizes, one of his, in fact, associates suggests that it is all because of Kamdhenu. So he took Kamdhenu, and Kamdhenu then complains to Vasishtha Muni that why are you, in fact, allowing me, or allowing him to take me? Then Vasishtha Muni says that, I'm helpless. I don't want you to go, but he has forced me to take you. So then Kamdhenu says that, okay, I will manage. And then the story, that each drop of sweat of Kamdhenu would, in fact, create one strong man, and finally the strong army, and Vishwamitra, who was then only a king, was completely defeated. And then he again came, and he was defeated. So finally he thought that he should be a Brahman. So Brahman has greater power. That is something very interesting. This story at the beginning is very interesting, which figures only in Darashiko's translation. And then, so he should become Brahman. But then, of course, Brahma comes, and Brahma says, okay, you combine Kshatriya and Brahman both. So
Raja plus Rishi, so Rajarshi.
Yes. But he is not Rajarishi. You will become Rajarshi. But he is not satisfied even with that. Finally, he becomes a real, Brahman, and he becomes Vishwamitra. So he reminds Vasishtha Muni to repeat the same message, or the nasihat that was given to him by, what was the nasihat? Nasihat was that you can become a good Brahman, and still you can become a good statesman, a good king. That is what, in fact, the entire discussions in Yoga Vasishtha is. So Darashiko reads Yoga Vasishtha as a kind of political treatise, the same kind of political treatise, or political ethics treatise, as the earlier Mughals, or even before the Mughals, the Muslims, Perso-Islamic world Muslims, had seen in, say, Aristotle's Nicomacheia, which, in fact, you have a manifestation of it, or summary of it, in Nasiruddin Tusi's Akhlaq-e Tusi, or Jalaluddin Davani's Akhlaq-e Jalali, or Hussain Wai's Kashfi's Akhlaq-e Mohsini. So, and the Akbar's, in fact, ambitions would be, right from Babar to Akbar. In fact, that is, I'm referring to Akhlaq-e Hussaini, perhaps, yes, this is called Akhlaq-e Hussaini. Ikhtiyar al-Hussaini's summary of, and particular, because in such texts you have a chapter on Mamlikat Dari, on political management, on statecraft, and at best or at worst you would find that in Akbar's time, with the advice, of course, of his primary ideologue Abul Fazl, he, in fact, is looking, the political norms, I won't say beyond Sharia, but in addition to Sharia, in order to, in fact, manage the different communities, the interest of the different communities, different ethnic groups. That is the maximum. And this has been, in fact, a trend, in fact, a part of a tradition of the Mughal. Jahangir also, in fact, to him was dedicated this summary translations of the Roman and Greco-Hellenic rulers' ethical and political ethics by Jerome Xavier, which is called Adab-e Sultanat, which is still to be published. But we have I have written an article on it with Sanjay Subramaniam. I have, in fact, and so that is one. Then even Murad Bakhsh, he looks for, in fact, the pattern of governance or the norms of governance in the pre-Islamic Sassanid world. And there is, in fact, a text which is called Tawqiyat-e-Kisravi, and this was translated into Arabic from Pahlavi in earlier times, and he wants this to be translated, and he got it translated into Mughal Persian under his supervision. So you have, in fact, an urge and a curiosity for looking for the norms of governance which could be ideal for a society which is so multi-ethnic, so multicultural. Now, but nobody, in fact, nor even Akbar. And here, of course, Akbar got, of course, translation of Mahabharata, commission, one of the major books, and several Ramayana and Mahabharata. But you do not have, in fact, any curiosity in even Akbar to look for ideals of governance in the descriptions of the rulers in Mahabharata. That is, in description of the rulers who ruled India before the coming of the Mughals, before the coming of Islam. Now, here,
I'm just thinking here, Muzaffarji, would it be fair to say that in the case of Akbar, there is a political vision to harmonize the indigenous sects, the Rajput sects. So he was probably looking through translations to understand the culture rather than looking at a model or a framework of kingship based on which he would have the foundations of his rule.
Yes. This is what, in fact, you have put it, in fact, in a very, succinct way. Yes, this is what I would like to. At that time, even until, the early years of Shah Jahan's time, you have the ambitions to accommodate, to understand, to appreciate. But here in Dara Shikoh, you have not simply appreciation. He had already shown the appreciation, in fact, to the extent that he saw many things similar in the Brahminical and Indic traditions. His book, Marad al-Bahrain. And then he, later on, he also translated yes, and and Upanishad, of course.
Yes.
So, and besides, so I think that, so here in this book, in fact, what comes out that he is keen to understand what would be the ideal, what has been ideal. And in his understanding, the ideal is, of course, the Raja Ramchandra. Raja Ramchandra is Bhagwan. He is Vishnu's representative, Vishnu's avatara, and he is also an ideal ruler. And this you can see besides. But of course, Dara Shikoh also appreciates his own stature. When he describes the dream, you have in his dream, in fact,
the younger brother.
Yes, and braided temporalities. Braided temporalities. He approves of the temporality, which is the hallmark of the Brahmanical tradition, that they are still today. So he said that they live today, and I am the person who had met them. And I have been blessed by, like Raja Ramchandra's, as Vashishta Muni is Raja Ramchandra's master, Raja Ramchandra's guru. So he is also, in fact, equally affectionate as any guru could be to me. And Raja Ramchandra was instructed by, his guru that I should be given special, in fact, sweet meat. I should be considered to be. So, and in this dream, it is interesting, he does not see Lakshman. He sees Raja Ramchandra. And so that is related to...
He himself is Lakshman because he himself is the younger brother.
Yes, he himself is, So the only thing is that Lakshman is not the ruler and he wants to become the ruler. And he thinks that he has already achieved that kind of high spiritualization. Because when he was only 25, he heard this Hatif, the voice of the Hatif, angelic voice, that you have achieved a stature in spiritual in spirituality which no other ruler had achieved before that. So, of course, tall claim, and which is not my concern. My concern is where, in fact, their activities come in the contact of average, ordinary people like you and me. So this is in fact what I I thought I should say in brief in response to this question. And it's already, in fact, yeah, I mean, we should be, in fact, considerate
Uh,
and respectful to the time given to us.
Yes,
Yeah.
Muzaffarji, we have a number of questions from the audience. As you can imagine, many of them we were putting them, displaying them on the screen, and it's not surprising that this has been such an astute, such an in-depth and engrossing conversation that many of these questions, and that's something that I was noting in passing on the private chat, is many of these questions have in fact been answered already by you. What I would like to do is I'd like to take up a quick couple of questions before we conclude today's program. We'll start with Aditra's question. This has to do with the music and sama. And yes, so his question is: has the Sufi Qawwali or sama come to India through the Chistis, or do we have other traditions, for example, Suravati?
Yeah, besides the Chistis, we also have in the Qadris, among the Qadris, but initially with the Chistis, because the Chistis, of course, Qadris came towards the end of the 16th century. Qadri order is widespread in the 17th century, but the Chishtis, of course, is amongst the first, together with the Sohrbardis, who entered with Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti. So, of course, and you have the debate about Sama as early as in the 14th century in Futuh Salatin by Asami. Very interesting, in fact, debate and discussion between the Qazis on the one hand and the Sufi on the other hand. Sufis, I think Hamiduddin Nagori on the other hand, and this is called Mahzar, and supervised and chaired by none other than the Sultan himself. So it is primarily with the Chishtis, but of course later very much a part of, and in fact it became also a part of the Naqshbandi in a measure.
Maybe in the 18th and towards late 18th and 19th
yes,
centuries.
yes.
So the amalgamation of the other.
Yes.
Muzaffarji, remind me and correct me if I'm wrong. I think the legend goes that there was a time when Khwaja Muinuddin, Nizamuddin Aulia was very upset, or he was depressed about something, and his disciple Hazrat Amir Khusro goes to him, and it is at his behest that he invents. It is the ijad of call or Qawwali with the first song Kunto Maula, and that is how Qawwali comes into being. Is
No,
that
that is
your understanding?
that is how. No, there in fact call becomes integrated into. But before that call, that what is called Man Kuntu Maula fa Aliyu Maula. Now this particular call, which is of course attributed to the Prophet, one of the last speeches of the Prophet after the last Hajj, and where he said, in fact, he raised the hand of Hazrat Ali and he said, Man kuntu Maula fa Aliyu Maula. So, and this is also being debated and discussed between the Sunnis and the Shias. I won't go into the details, but that all, because of that call, this particular Sama then began to be called Qawwali. But earlier, before that, and that could be true, Nizamuddin Aulia is so close to not simply, in fact, the call. Nizamuddin Aulia was also reported that this is with reference to the Bagh Bahari story, that, when he was taken ill, Khusro, in fact, invented or wrote this story, and he would read out this story. This is in prose, of course, interspersed with verses to Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, and Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, of course, recovered. And then, of course, blessing is that whosoever will read this will also be recovered from illness or ailment. So that is a different thing. That's you, at best, you can say that this is the second and more formalized and advanced stage of that. In Sama, you cannot think of Sama after this unless you start with Qawl. But before that, of course, Sama would be even, Sama could be just a ghazal of any poet, Nizami or the earlier Persian poet, or even sometimes the Sama could be even the prose, not necessarily because the idea of Sama is that you get intoxicated by listening to the words which go into your heart, and so that is, yes, that is true. That legend could be true. I would not dispute that. But the dispute and debate and record of Sama is even before that, and that is reported, in fact, in Futuh Salatin, the first one.
Right. Wonderful. So, Muzaffarji, there was another question that I got on the chat box from, this is actually from Dipeshda, and he wanted to understand from you if you're looking at the legacy of the Sufis or the Sufis in contemporary India, and I'm expanding on that. So we go to the Dargah in Ajmer Sharif or Fatehpur Sikri or Nizamuddin Aulia and so many other places in Southeast Asia. How do you view the legacy of the Sufis and their influence in the politics of contemporary India?
Very difficult question. Very difficult question. Unless, in fact, this, in part, the response to this question I have given in the introduction, the long history of Sufism and Indian Muslim political culture. Right from, if you go to Jahanara's time, then Sufis are considered to be really very powerful. So you cannot go ahead in any worldly things, worldly or otherworldly, unless you are in association with one or the other Sufi. So your advisor is a Sufi. And because in the life hereafter, you will be nowhere if you are not under one or the other banner of one or the other Sufis. That is the belief. And then, of course, throughout, I have shown that how, by the time of Sir Syed initially, Sir Syed, the founder of Aligarh, initially, or founder of rationality, Muslim rationality or modernism and whatnot, initially, he's so, in fact, respectful and reverent to the Sufis of his father. In fact, he mentioned that he himself grew in the laps of one of the Sufis, I forget his name, whose disciple was his father. So, but gradually he becomes quote unquote Wahhabi. I'm using the modern term Wahhabi. That is, he questions the validity. And one of the essays that I have cited in the introduction that he wrote, in fact, he literally tamaskhur, not simply sarcastic. He laughs at whatever the Sufis claim in terms of his spirituality and in terms of something.
He's mocking their philosophy.
Mocking at what
Yes.
you have said in Mokashfa or Epiphanies. So that is what, in fact, the modern Muslim is. But then you recover, in fact, in Iqbal's poetry. And Iqbal, of course, is the leader of the Muslim mind, at least Muslim thought and Muslim mind in the early 20th century. So, but the result is that the Sufis, despite the fact that Ashraf Ali Thanvi is such a great scholar, Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani is a great, but he is a great because he is participating in politics. He is not great because he's a Sufi. So the thing is that power, that mundane power or political power that you would in fact believe in the Sufis, that belief in fact gradually got eroded in course of time. And today, even I would be, suspect that, whatever, that you have in the political, even in the political chronicles, or Shah Jahan's dream of Khaja Khizr alias. In fact, where is that? In fact, where is that? So in such a situation, that political power, which in fact which is associated in Mughal times with a Sufi, is lost. Now, if it is lost, then people would hardly listen to him. So therefore, it's the question of, but there are individuals, but as an institution, on both the political institutions and of course, on the other hand, the spiritual, Sufis institutions. Jamaat-e-Sufia, there is a Jamaat-e-Sufia in India, but who listened to Jamaat-e-Sufia? Of course, Modi initially, even Modi went there and he gave a speech and the political figures are shown, presenting chadar, that flower on the, but it's not like even Akbar, because whatever Akbar in fact donated to shrine, still it is shown that big piece of the diamond in the he studied in fact that is in the grave of Khaja Majnun Chishti. So this is how I will respond.
Yes.
No. So today, no.
The importance, the relevance of it, the immediacy of it is.
But relevance, of course, I would think that today, in relations to the Maulvis and Mullahs, I would, as a student of history and as somebody who's of course Muslim and who has done theology and who has done a bit of Sufi studies, I would think that the Sufis would lead you to a better path than if he is not very much under the influence of the new modern Chishti Sufi. Because modern Chishti Sufi, in fact, I have discussed that Chishti Sufi also became completely transformed in the early 18th century. There is no sama in the literate part of the Chishti Sufi. The like Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, he's one of the greatest Chishti Sufis of the 20th century, but he would not approve of sama. While of course sama is there in Nizamuddin Auliya.
Which is so interesting, right? So in the earlier times, the Naqshbandis, through the 17th century, there is no sama. 18th and 19th century, there is sama.
Yes.
Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, up until then, the Chishtis, sama is an integral part, and after that, there is no sama. So it's like a reversal.
Yeah, in fact, this in fact, I haven't read the details, but this is in terms of the individuals. The institution, as an institution, it gets weakened. So it is the individual. Which individual is in position, in which time, at which time, in which group of the Sufis. So
this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation, and of course I have a vested interest. Whenever I talk to you, I learn so much and I take away so much, and I'm sure this has been an absolute delight for all the viewers who've been tuning in. I want to thank you very much on behalf of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, on behalf of Prohor, on behalf of all of the viewers and listeners, all your readers and your followers. Thank you so very much, Adab. And for viewers, please stay tuned in. We'll be back again next month with another engrossing interview.
So thank you very much, and thank you very much for the patient's generous words. I didn't have time to thank him, and your generous words and the questions and the time. And I'm so sorry. And this is what, in fact, I'm still in 17th century, and this is my historical imagination that despite being 21st century, I do not trust much technology. So how it is at, but of course, you are in the 21st century. If one failed, the other one came to your rescue.
Exactly.
So I'm so sorry because of the
No. This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Muzaffar.
Okay. Adab. Bye.
Bye.